Monsieur le Président du Conseil constitutionnel, cher Monsieur le Président Fabius, c'est un honneur tout particulier pour moi et pour nous tous de vous accueillir aujourd'hui. Dear Professor Robert Engel and Mrs. Engel, dear ECGI Board Chair Herman Daems, dear representatives, partners, and friends of ECGI, distinguished panelists and guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and honor for my wife Sophie Lelius, for my team, and for me to welcome you all today to the French Embassy on this very special occasion as we are gathered here for the 2024 ECGI Responsible Capitalism Summit. I'd like to start, of course, by expressing my warmest thanks to the European Corporate Governance Institute, the ECGI, for organizing the important summit. It's second after the inaugural summit held 2 years ago in Brussels. With a particular word of thanks and appreciation to ECGI Board Chair Herman Daems, Vice Chair Professor Elleringer, Executive Director Professor Becht, ECGI board members, and the ECGI team who are with us today. ECGI, ladies and gentlemen, is recognized worldwide for its commitment to corporate governance and environmental responsibility by bringing together world-leading researchers and forging invaluable ties between policymakers and the worlds of business and academic research. We are indeed privileged today to welcome leading actors to help us find answers to the key question you have chosen for this summit. How can we accelerate progress towards the net zero emission target a decade after the Paris Agreement signed in 2015? In this respect, ladies and gentlemen, it is an immense honor to welcome President Laurent Fabius. President Fabius presided over COP21, which led to the Paris Agreement. As such, he is the central architect of this landmark agreement. Under his watch, I think I can say that beyond the eminent responsibilities he's been holding in France, Foreign Affairs and Finance Minister, Prime Minister, President of the National Assembly, President of the Constitutional Council, France's Supreme Court today, President Fabius has made and continues to make the fight for climate his life's work. And I think we can give him a wide range of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, it's also a great honor to welcome Professor Engel, Nobel Prize recipient in economics with Madame Engel. Your presence and contribution this afternoon means so much to all of us, and we very much look forward to hearing your remarks and thoughts to help find the right answers. And really, thank you so much. For me, I must say, COP21 is also a personal story. I was ambassador to the UN at the time, and President Fabius asked me to work alongside him during the COP21 summit to bring the world negotiators' points of view closer together and reach an agreement. This was, for me, needless to say, a lifetime experience. And just a short anecdote, if I may, on the evening of the first day of the COP21 summit, in front of thousands of delegates present, President Fabius announced, to my great surprise, I must confess, that I would be at their full disposal during all the days and nights of the summit. My greatest surprise was and nights. So I literally spent 14 all-nighters in a row and did not sleep a wink. It is something you don't forget. In the months that followed, while I was still France's UN ambassador, Sophie and I, in that order, organized and led a series of meetings with major institutional investors and their trustees that resulted in the launch of Climate Action 100 Plus at the One Planet Summit in France a few months later. The coalition remains to this day the largest investor group on climate. Mes chers amis, you can count on France's commitment to implementing the Paris Agreement. We understand the role of business, finance, and law to achieve its objectives. To give you just an illustration of this, France passed a seminal law on energy transition that same year, in 2015, which laid the foundations for sustainable finance in France. So that was truly an important thing to do. In the years that followed, France, together with Germany, have been at the forefront of European and international efforts to fight against climate change and preserve biodiversity. These include the Green Deal for Europe and the Fit for 55 package, with the ambitious and necessary goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. We are determined to stay on this path and provide companies and investors alike with the frameworks and predictability they need to invest and succeed in the transition towards a low-carbon economy. We know that the ecological transition, like the digital transition and Europe's defense, will require huge investments. The report that Mario Draghi has just submitted to the President of the European Commission deals with these issues with gravity and detail. That's why the push for the creation of a European Capital Markets Union to create a single market for capital is a top priority today, for which France and Germany have taken the lead to make this a reality and to allow business, investors, and other providers of capital to accelerate these transitions. The key challenge is to ensure that these transitions and an EU growth agenda are well aligned and move forward together to drive EU competitiveness. Today's ECGI Summit, which brings together the perspectives of policymakers, business executives, and boards of directors, financial actors, and research academics, is an important and precious contribution in this direction. So I wish you, ladies and gentlemen, insightful and productive discussions this afternoon. And now I give the floor to ECGI Chair Herman Daems, and my warmest thanks to each and every one of you. Merci.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur de France, Monsieur le Président du Cour constitutionnel Laurent Fabius, Professor and Nobel Laureate Robert Engel, Madame Engel, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. You know from the picture there that I'm Herman Daems because not so many of you meet me regularly. But I'm the chairman of ECGI, and as chairman, I'm extremely and excessively proud to honor and to welcome you all here in Berlin for our second conference in the Responsible Capitalism series. I want also to express the gratitude of ECGI to the ambassador and our keynote speakers, President Fabius, Professor Engel, and Jennifer Morgan, who will join us later. But I also want to express my gratitude to our speakers this morning and our panel members this afternoon. We held the conference 2 years ago in Brussels. Several of you were there, and we very much appreciate that you are here again to continue the debate on how responsible capitalism can move the climate agenda. ECGI is a forum for research-based debate on important, and I must say, not only important, but also very hard and difficult corporate governance issues. Scholars across the world rely on ECGI to communicate their research to other scholars, to policymakers, to opinion makers, and of course, and maybe the most important, to company leaders and boards. That is why ECGI took on the topic of responsible capitalism. As you know, there are very many critical questions in society and also in academia, whether the current economic and social systems will be able to deal effectively and efficiently with arguably one of the greatest challenges the world has ever faced, namely climate change. We all know the deficiencies of capitalism. I name just a few. Recurrent financial instability. Think about 2008. Incomplete and imperfect markets with inappropriate pricing of climate and environmental issues. But there is more. Often capitalism generates inequality and exclusion. That's the negative side. But on the other hand, we also know that capitalism has been more successful than other social systems in bringing income and wealth to many parts of the world. The reasons for capitalism's success arise from decentralized decision-making, markets, price systems, and from holding people and institutions responsible for the bad and the good that their actions have. And we should not forget that capitalism cannot function without a wise and effective government. At ECGI, we bring the best minds together in this series of conferences to sketch out a plan for making capitalism more responsible. The place where this must start is in the boardrooms of companies. Much has happened there, but much more needs to be done. Responsible boards must care about their companies, but they must also care about the impact of their companies on individuals, on society, and on climate. They have to do that now, but also in the future. As we will see today, and as we already discovered this morning, the issues are very complex, as Professor Engel will show in his keynote. It will require new markets, as we learned this morning, and it will require new pricing mechanisms, and it will require intelligent regulation. But I believe it can be done with good and clear thinking and with the ambition to make capitalism responsible for this world and for the people in this world. Climate change is focusing our minds. We are very proud that we have President Fabius among us, who shared the Paris conference and achieved the Paris Agreement on climate change nearly 10 years ago. We are eager to learn from him how he sees the progress that has been made and how he evaluates the contributions of governments and companies. But before we turn the floor over to President Fabius, let me first ask Marco Becht to give his perspective on what has been happening. Marco Becht is the executive director of ECGI, and as all of you know, the real soul of ECGI. Thank you very much.
So as Herman said, my name is Marco Becht. I co-founded ECGI in 2002 with colleagues. I'm also German, and it's quite emotional for me to stand here. My mother was a big Francophone. My father was a big Francophone. He had a PhD from the Sorbonne. And their greatest frustration was that I decided to go to the infidious Albion and study at the London School of Economics. So my apologies for that. So my job really now is to briefly introduce, in case you've forgotten, the Paris Agreement, and then make the link with corporate governance, because some of you might have asked yourself, well, what are we going to do in that afternoon? What's the link with corporate governance? So I'll try to do that, and then also play some hooks to the keynotes and the panels, and also what was said this morning. So it is quite symbolic to be here, of course, in the French embassy at Pariser Platz to discuss a decade after Paris. But if you go back to Genesis, there's another reason to be in Berlin, because actually COP1 was in Berlin. Helmut Kohl had invited people to come here, and he'd entrusted the hosting of the COP1 to his newly minted Minister of the Environment and Nuclear Safety. And the irony will not escape you in a second, because that is the lady who's standing there, and her name is one Angela Merkel. Okay, so she was actually the host of COP1. Now, move forward, we had, of course, Kyoto, then Copenhagen, etc., and we arrive in Paris. It's no longer this small, cute gathering, but it's a wall of dark suits. The expectations, you see the blue sprinkle, that is Frau Merkel, and there's a wall of blue suits. In fact, the photographer had a hard time taking the picture from the front. Expectations were very low. Nobody expected this to succeed, but then you all know what happened, okay? And I leave you to judge from the faces the joy of the different participants. May I say, President Fabius, you look rather exhausted, okay? But we'll hear in a second what you thought. Now, then, of course, what happened afterwards is remarkable in many respects. So first of all, what was the agreement? Well, what's remarkable about the agreement as a scientist, it is based on science. There's a definite reference to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it's science-based. It makes a reference to 1.5 to 2 degrees. And my wife is a lawyer. It's law. It is an international climate agreement, and that makes a difference whether it's law or not law. I'll leave you to the French diplomacy website to read the further details of what the other points are, because there are many of what the achievements were. Now, what's also remarkable is that if you look today, it took a while, it took about until 2020, but today, in terms of global emissions, over 70% of global emissions are covered by national pledges based on Paris, and 15% are actually rooted in law. Now, it doesn't depends on what you think about law and things that are enshrined in law, but we do think in the terms of rule of law that makes a difference. So 15% is enshrined in law, and actually people can get sued like the UK government recently, if they don't abide by their own laws. And I'm jumping again to President Fabius. His other hat, President of the Constitutional Court, comes in very handy here in that dimension. Now, if you then look at what's been achieved, we need to start talking about gigatons of CO2, which was already mentioned this morning. I discussed this with Beatrice Weber Di Mauro. This is the metric that we all need to look at, gigatons of CO2. And if you look at the policies that are required, we have, first of all, the pledges that I told you about. This comes from Climate Action Tracker. In terms of pledges, we fall short. And in terms of implementation strategies, we also fall short by a number of gigatons. So work needs to be done if we want to be Paris compatible. Now, that's the sovereign, that's the national country perspective. What about the private sector? Now, the other thing that's remarkable about the Paris Agreement is it brought in the private sector. And this is Net Zero Tracker, who tracks the pledges by cities, by regions, by countries, but also by companies. They track the largest 2,000 listed companies, and just about half of them have actually made net zero commitments, corporations making net zero commitments. And that brings us to responsible business, responsible investment, responsible banking and insurance, because boards have to decide how they're going to deal with this and how they are going to incorporate Paris into their strategies, their business plans, and everything else. And given everything we know in science, if you do not do that as a board or as an investor, you are not really behaving responsibly, because you know that you're going to do damage to the planet and to people. So it is your duty, actually, to incorporate the Paris Agreement into your strategy. So corporate governance enters the fold. Now, actually, 1,000 is not enough if you go to SBTI, which accredits, which checks whether these statements being put out by corporations are just verbiage or whether they're actually true commitments. The number of corporations that have actually, the number of companies that have made commitments is actually larger, because you also have to count in SMEs and you have to count in financial institutions, including banks. So this then leads me to the forward-looking plans, because if you are now an investor, what you want to know is people make these pledges, what do these look like? And we have institutions now like the Transition Pathway Initiative, TPI, that actually checks this. They check the solid line, which is how are people actually doing in terms of their emissions? And then the dotted lines, what are their commitments? And I'm just picking out here the oil and gas sector. And you, of course, know the top two lines. That's Saudi Aramco and Exxon. They've said, we are not making any pledges. We're not making any promises. We're going to keep drilling, pumping, etc., like, there was no day tomorrow. Then you have some Europeans that are in the middle. That's Total Energies and Eni. And then you have promises from BP, actually BP and Eni, it's Repsol that's in the middle, and Total Energies. You have promises from BP and Eni to be net zero by 2050, but to 2030, they're not really there. Now, you look at this, you are a finance person, and then enter the question, what is your view of this, even if you leave out morals? Well, it's a risk proposition, because if you invest in Exxon, it's a risk. You are essentially saying, I do not believe what I showed you before, these commitments by these countries covering all these emissions, is going to work. So it is a risk proposition. And working out long-term risk, that is Rob Engler's new specialty. So this brings right in our Nobel Prize keynote lecturer. Now, which sectors are the ones that are most affected? This is a chart again from Climate Action Tracker. It is actually the elephant in the room is energy. they really have, in terms of, again, these 60 rough gigatons of emissions, they contribute over 20%. So energy sector is the one that really needs to be, that's the number one priority. And in the panel this afternoon, we have a panel with a large energy consumer, a health supply company, AstraZeneca, and we also have a company that is providing solutions or is trying to provide solutions as part of its business plan to the energy transition, Siemens Energy. Okay, so we're going to hear from them about this particular sector. Now, many of these transition plans, if you look at the corporate transition plans, many of them can't really do without carbon offsets. And this is very complicated, it's controversial. We had a special session this morning to discuss this with a great paper from Zach Harlem and from my colleague Estelle Cantillon. And Estelle reminded us that you must not just look at this problem in terms of emissions, you must also look at this in terms of sinks, because one, of course, offsets the other one. Now, Estelle stressed that current proposals actually try to, you can offset one with the other, but that's double counting. You mustn't do that. And then how to create incentives to reduce emissions through carbon emission trading schemes or whatever, and at the same time encourage people to have more offsets is really important. But it's not easy. Another point that was raised this morning is, of course, you can cut down woods, turn them into biochar, and then, have a fast-growing tree monoculture, but that then really upsets the other goal we have, which is biodiversity. So, establishing the right metrics here is really, really important and not trivial. We then had another paper this morning, and this is again pure Paris, which is about exit policy by banks. So Boris Vallée presented this slide. I picked it, during lunch. I nicked this from you, Boris. Apologies. Okay, and what this really shows is that in comes Paris, banks start having exit policies, defunding fossil fuels, in particular, in this case, coal. And the question Boris asked, and actually Marcin Kaperczyk this morning, was, does that have impact? And I think they credibly showed that this is putting a lot of pressure on coal companies because they are financially constrained. Now, that's good news. The unfortunate thing is that if you look at total CO2 emissions from coal, it has not dented it yet. And we thought that we'd got coal under control. We haven't got coal under control, so there's other work to do, and we'll discuss in the finance panel, whether finance is enough or not. Now then, Climate Action 100 Plus was mentioned. It is a remarkable achievement. It's been studied by academics. It is really, really, really path-setting. In fact, it is so upsetting that there's some backlash to it in the United States, which we will not discuss. Now, it also does its own self-evaluation, and it has achieved some things, in particular on coal, but it is not really achieved very much on the others. So more pressure is needed also from investors. But the good news is some of them are doing something. So again, finance comes in, corporate governance, trying to influence corporations to get on the Paris path. Now, then we also have proposals, that's engagement, so that's a big corporate governance piece, but then also investors can, like they defund companies, they can also do this for equities. They can basically exit high-emitting companies, which is a risk mitigation tool, but it also might put pressure. And there, Fred Samama, who is here today, who was very much involved also with COP, Patrick Bolton and Marcin Kaperczyk have made proposals. Fred has tried to bring this from the academic thinking to a practical product and bring it to the world so it's available. Whether people adopt it or not is another question. Now then, of course, if you're too frustrated by all of this, there is another solution, which is we can go to Mars. And as you might have read, Elon Musk is going to get us to go there by 2044. And forgive me, Ambassador, for reading this from the New York Times. He's also going to donate some of his personal sperm to the project. Okay, we can wonder what that will do. And of course, this is going to be also a little governance issue. Is this going to be a corporation that's going to own the Mars colony? And what's that governance going to be? Anyway, but that's for a future conference. And in the meantime, back on Earth, the temperatures keep rising. This is the latest data from the Copernicus satellite. And this picture is not a picture of Mars. That's actually from last week. That's Earth. It's never been as hot as that before. And, I don't want to close on that, note. We have work to do. We don't have much time, but that's why we are here. And the title of the conference is Accelerating Progress to Net Zero. And I want to close with another picture because I'm now quite emotional. It is my great pleasure in an emotional way to turn the floor to President Fabius to pick up on the challenge and tell us how he sees we can actually accelerate progress to what he started at COP21. President Fabius, it's an honor. Thank you.